will be now read the second time. The honourable member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. I welcome the opportunity to speak on the Prisoner Remissions Bill. We've had a very good discussion and debate already, and I think many good issues have been raised and views shared, and it's natural that there would be a variety of views in this place on this matter. There's many good points being made, and I'll try to be fairly brief and just touch on the ones that I'd like to reiterate, knowing that other members have covered certain elements in greater detail, and that will be on the record. I appreciate that the bill we're discussing attempts to provide greater clarity around how remissions are used in our prison service, and I welcome those elements of the bill that aim to provide that clarity. But at this stage, I cannot support a bill which removes remissions entirely. So mostly I would like to speak about that aspect of the bill rather than those other elements which I think the member for Murchison clarified we could achieve some of those other intents through regulation. And I thought that was a point well made. So I'm not able to support this bill, and there's two quite simple reasons for that. Firstly, we're debating a policy that appears to be more about ideology than policy. I find that it seems to be more that we are looking at a slogan, truth in sentencing, rather than a case being made around a clear problem that we are trying to solve with this action of removing remissions. And I think that's really the core of any action we take with policy or legislation. We've identified a problem that we wish to solve or an outcome that we wish to achieve, and we find the best way towards that solution or that the achievement of that outcome. I find that there isn't a clearly articulated problem here to solve or a clearly articulated outcome that is being sought. And secondly, the other simple reason that I can't support this bill is that while also missing those first things, it, I think, provides the potential to contribute to the difficulties that are already being experienced in our prison system, particularly in regard to staffing and overcrowding. So firstly, I'll just speak for a moment on that second point and then come back in more detail to the first. In recent times, we've heard yet again that staff shortages at Risdon Prison have resulted in the prisoners being placed under lockdown on a fairly regular basis. This is not the fault of our prison officers, who do an extremely important job in a very challenging environment. I believe it's a systemic problem which the government has known about for years and is quite a challenging one to address, but the government is yet to properly address it. Staff shortages negatively affect working conditions, as prison officers have to work in increasingly what I would imagine to be heated and tense environments. Mr President, lockdowns also adversely affect or impact upon prisoners through reduced access to educational programs, to other forms of offender programs, being denied visits from family and friends, all matters that can be quite ameliorative for them within the prison environment. We heard in April about how people who should have been released on bail were instead held in remand due to being on a wait list to be accepted into appropriate housing. I find that a further disturbing aspect of our dire shortage of affordable housing in this state, and another unfortunate aspect of an overcrowded prison also. Staff shortages in the prison are also ultimately impacting on our state's finances. In fact, under questioning from the member for Windermere, we learned that this government spent $5.7 million on overtime for staff in the last financial year alone. It looks to me that even with all the overtime that's being done, the prison is still being regularly put into lockdown, almost potentially on a daily basis. It would seem that the prison's being locked down because there are insufficient staff to fully, and I guess probably safely, operate it. That's a disturbing situation, and I think...
Through you, Mr President, the lockdown's occurring through criminal activity within the jail as well and violence in the jail as well. Not just...
Thank you for your comment on that, Member for Windermere. I'll take questions at any stage.
There's a question, are they?
Very good call.
Are they? The question is, are they being...
Well, I'm not in a position to answer that question. You'd probably be best to ask the government in relation to that through our usual processes.
I thought you might, because you were talking about it.
Yeah. Well, I was talking about the points I was making. You were asking me a question about something different. I'll leave you to follow that up through other channels. On top of the staff shortages we appear to be experiencing, we're also experiencing serious overcrowding in our prisons. In the 12 months to June this year, Tasmania's prison population grew from 596 to 689, I believe. The issue of overcrowding was acknowledged as the prison service's biggest challenge by the state's custodial inspector, Richard Connick. This has resulted in cells that have been designated for 1 or 2 people now being double or triple bunked. Furthermore, due to the lack of space, prisoners who are supposed to be in medium security, I understand, have at times ended up, prisoners who are supposed to be in minimum security, I've heard, have ended up at times in medium security. And we can all imagine how both of those issues, the staffing issues and the overcrowding issues, can lead to negative outcomes for the prisoners and for prison staff, I would think, quite substantially. Mr President, I appreciate that more could be said about the state of our prisons. I just wanted to make those points briefly. I think at the heart of it, what we are all interested in is the safety and welfare of all Tasmanians. And politics aside, I'm sure everyone in this chamber, regardless of viewpoints around certain particular elements, can agree that more needs to be done with our prison system to make sure that it works well for everybody involved, including the broader community. So, although we're given that current set of circumstances and difficulties that have been experienced in our state's prisons, I don't believe that removing remissions at this stage would contribute materially to addressing any of those challenges faced. And indeed, I think what we've heard is that the removal of remissions will likely add about 40 people to our prisons per year. And I can hardly see that an additional 40 prisoners will do anything but exacerbate that already difficult situation. I'm going to move on now to talk about that first point that I raised, which is really the key concern I have and the reason I can't support this bill. And that's in relation to the fact that I don't believe a case has been made that the removal of remissions is something that's required or advisable. I wonder where this call is coming from. I wonder what problem we are seeking to solve in removing remissions. Who's raised the call to bring this measure to bear? Did it come through the prison systems themselves? Has it just been tagged on to the slogan, truth in sentencing? I don't believe there's been a robust case made. I agree with the comments made by the member for Hobart. He asked in relation to the claim that it is to meet community expectations, how were those community expectations measured, and in what explicit way were those community expectations translated into a call to remove remissions? I think it's important for us to be very clear about the distinction between the opportunity to improve and make more transparent the process for granting remission, as opposed to whether or not remission has value or presents a problem that we must solve. It's quite likely that we could improve the implementation and transparency and accountability of the remissions process. Indeed, the community could quite rightly expect that there would be regular efforts to best utilise and most accountably implement the remissions process. And I would certainly argue for a review of that process with a view to ensuring the stringency and accountability of its application. We clearly have heard that the remissions system that's in place has a role to play. It has a role to play in incentivising good behaviour in our prison system. And at no stage during the briefings that we received from people involved in that system did I hear a call being made for the removal of the remissions system, the process in place. Remissions in the Tasmanian Prison Service is seen as a good incentive for prisoners and a useful behaviour management tool. We've heard that through a number of sources, people who interact into that system and people within the system itself. Therefore, I think removing remissions has the potential to limit the tools available to our prison staff in managing behaviour. They're not just my fears. We've heard, and it's been referred to already today, they're the fears of key voices in this field. And we've been listened to by that group of organisations who all have connection with and work into the prison space and have expressed that view to us. I think we have to probably be sort of clear that remissions, as far as I understand them, are generally not there as a tool that would be focused at or targeted towards what we might term as hardened criminals. I don't believe that they're used or intended to be used for that cohort of prisoners, but more as a behaviour management tool for prisoners, particularly or maybe on shorter sentences. And in that circumstance, they're in fact an effort to encourage people away from becoming more hardened, in inverted commas, by their experiences in jail. I respect that in Parliament we're going to have different views on that and on many aspects of this topic. However, in presenting this policy, actually I fear that the government has been more guided by ideology than on producing good evidence-based policy and legislation. I believe it's our responsibility to refer as much as possible to the evidence and to good practice when making policy. This results in informed decisions which have the least chance of negatively impacting upon the community. So that would prompt us to say, what does the evidence say on this? On this, we know that improving our prison system means improving or providing more rehabilitative, probably more effective rehabilitative and education programs within the prison system, including offender programs. Doing so helps to improve the outcomes of everybody involved. It helps the working conditions for our prison staff as prisoner behaviour is improved with greater provision of those programs and services. It helps prisoners themselves by improving their overall well-being, with education being particularly a very positive step for them to take during the time that they spend in prison. It helps the economy as prisoners with higher levels of education upon leaving prison, and also more capacity in terms of socialisation, more capacity in terms of relationships, less likelihood to be on having challenges with drug and alcohol issues. All of those circumstances being improved during the time in prison means that people are more likely on release to be successful in re-entering society and in fact becoming contributing and very positive members of our community. Ultimately, I think the improved rehabilitation programs are the things that best help improve the safety of our community.
Well, I needed that.
Studies into prisoner reoffending show that a prisoner is less likely to be re-incarcerated and increase the severity of their offending if they have had experience with good, effective rehabilitation and education and offender programs while they've been during their time in prison. I was very pleased to hear during our briefings and information provided on this bill to hear about the TAFE courses offered in Risdon Prison. I think it's a really promising step towards improving prisoner welfare to provide education programs, and it also is a step towards improving outcomes for our wider community to do that. In our briefings, it's been helpful to hear about the various other educationally focused courses or rehabilitative offender programs that are offered in the prison system. And while noting that this is a range of worthwhile programs and we're given to understand today offered over a period of time, I also note that there remain some questions on the access to those courses and programs for all prisoners. We're given to understand that such opportunities are allocated on the basis of targeting those prisoners who are most at risk or most in need. And that targeting is required because it would appear that there are a lack of resources, compounded with other factors such as difficulty in recruiting appropriate staff to deliver courses and difficulty in anticipating prisoner population and therefore the level of need. All of those factors contribute to the fact that it would seem, as reported to us, that not all prisoners do have access to courses and offender programs that are relevant to their offending. The member for Windermere just previously asked what more could they do, and I think that that's a good question. I think we would all answer that question by saying there is always more we could do to make improvements, and we would not dream of looking at our current situation and say that's our best possible effort that we could aspire to. So I would think that we would all agree here that what more could they do? The answer to that is there will always be further efforts towards improvements in what we provide that delivers greater experiences within the prison for staff, for prisoners, and ultimately for our community when people are released. I see no reason that we need to have an either-or debate about remissions versus other behavioural management tools that are available within the prisons, or an either-or debate about remissions versus the range of other educational and offender programs that are available. It would seem to me that the more tools available, the better, to manage behaviour, incentivise good behaviour and equip people to be in a much more positive circumstance when they leave prison, to enhance that rehabilitative experience during incarceration for the better outcomes of our community in the long run. The safety of the community is posited as a rationale for the removal of remissions. I don't believe that case has remotely been made. I think we could make a case that would say that improving the remission system, ensuring accountability, doing a review to make sure that we have that system operating as it's intended, that it's accountable to its intentions, and that it's delivered according to the way it's designed, would be a good effort towards improving safety in our community. I have not heard an argument made successfully that says the removal of remissions equals increased safety in the community. However, I'm not convinced that... No, pardon me. Indeed, what I actually suspect and would anticipate is that the impact of removal of remissions, of our remission system, would be most felt not in the community, but within the prison system itself, by staff and by other prisoners. Removing what is regarded, and we have heard quite clearly from a range of sources, is a useful behaviour management tool, could reasonably be expected to have repercussions internally in the prison system. Given that, I wonder what is proposed to replace the acknowledged positive impact that remissions have once they are intended to be removed. Is it greater funding and staffing levels generally? Is it greater staff funding and staffing levels for offending programs? Is it greater funding and staffing levels for educational programs? Mr. President, I wonder, even if commitments were made for all of the above, it still isn't clear that this would ameliorate the loss of the tool of remissions. I think all those things should absolutely be committed to for our prison system broadly, and I think that remissions should be retained as a valuable tool within the toolkit available in our system of prisons. I would like to clearly understand, though, from the government what commitments they are making to ensure that the working conditions and the well-being of our prison staff isn't compromised further by the removal of remissions. We've talked about the fact that other states in various ways have removed remissions from their systems, and others have spoken at this in detail. I'm going to mention it briefly. It is good practice to look at other jurisdictions when you are seeking to make good public policy. It's part of establishing an evidence base for the best way forward. However, without a starting point for our policy process here of an identified problem to solve or an identified outcome to achieve, it becomes problematic to well implement other good practice public policy making processes. So, while we might look to other jurisdictions and note that they've removed remissions, without knowing why we want to do it, and without knowing what we want to achieve by doing it, we don't know whether we can be informed by what they've done before us and take lessons one way or another from what other states have done. We certainly know that their circumstances will be particular to each state. We know that they will have, in various ways undoubtedly, made different arrangements or other arrangements around the removal of remissions from their jurisdictions. It's not easy for us to apply a situation where we look to them and say, they've done it over there, therefore we should do it over here. That's just not good enough for public policy making in this state. Our community deserve much, much better than that sort of simplistic thinking. We've had a fairly interesting discussion and some interesting interjections here around the purpose of incarceration. And I don't want to speak to that in any great detail while I stand here, other than to state very simply that there'll be a range of views on that. My particular view is that the purpose of incarceration is to punish, and the deprival of liberty is a very serious punishment that we levy on people who have broken the law. The deprival of liberty is the ultimate punishment, short of capital punishment, that we can put on people in our community. I firmly believe that the deprival of liberty is the punishment aspect when people are sentenced, and what circumstances we surround them with while their liberty is being deprived is very key to us achieving a good outcome in terms of the risk of reoffending and the protection of our community ultimately. So I believe, and I'm all for, us using evidence-informed research and thinking about the best rehabilitative functions we put in place around the people from whom we deprive of their liberty through incarceration. They are being punished, but we also need to make sure that they won't need to be punished again. And we do that by equipping them with pro-social skills, by assisting them with health issues like drug and alcohol, by assisting them with offender programs that address the problematic behaviour that may have led to their offending, and by giving them skills and education to take with them when they leave prison to become constructive and positive members of our community. So that's my view on the purpose of incarceration. And within that, coming back to this bill, I believe that keeping the arrangement we have around remissions, which by all reports to us is a useful tool in behaviour management, has a potential rehabilitative function and assists people to leave prison in a more positive fashion if it's implemented stringently and accountably. I believe that that's a very compelling reason to keep it. So just to sum up, I don't believe the case has been made for this measure to be taken of removing remissions. The problem that we are trying to solve with this has never been identified, and the outcome ultimately we're trying to achieve with this has also not been properly articulated beyond something very broad and amorphous around safety for the community. How will we know when this measure has worked, in inverted commas? It's an important question to ask whenever we're implementing a policy response, and it sits alongside the fact that we must have an identified problem we're trying to solve or outcome we're trying to achieve when we put policy in place. At some point we will want to ask ourselves and want to be able to know clearly, has this measure worked? And so I'm very interested to hear, if we were to have this bill pass and remove remissions from our system, how will we know that that has worked as a positive and good public policy measure that delivers better outcomes to our community? So for all those reasons, and because of the potential negative impact I see it having, I can't support this bill.
While you're on your feet, because I need to, you asked the 40, you mentioned 40 people a year.
Well, that might be able to be clarified by the government. I believe that we heard that figure in one of our briefings.
Yeah, and while you're there, and with a little indulgence here, because I actually said this morning that I thought prisoner cost was $300 a day. According to the Auditor General for 15-16, it was 378. So if we assume 378 and the 40, and 3 months is 90 days that they can't, now that they take it away, that's going to be an extra $1.36 million a year of expense if we don't have the remissions. If it's only 40, $3.78 a day.
And that's just an economic cost. What we also have to, I guess, think about is the environmental cost within the prison system itself, in terms of overcrowding, in terms of stress on staff, and the way that impacts by having more prisoners incarcerated at any given time impacts on that environment.
Early on, you asked, I think the member for Windermere gave a figure about what was the overspend for...
It was the spend on overtime through in the last financial year, I believe, and it was $5.7 million on overtime for staff in the last financial year alone.
Okay.
That's what and if I need to be corrected on that, I'm happy to be corrected, but that's what I believe came from a question asked by the member for Windermere in this place.
Thank you. That was a very good question, member from Windermere.
Thank you.
I'd just like to, before we move further on, welcome the second group from